Tonight on AL24 News Special, we're tracking the profound global tremors following the June 17th ceasefire memorandum. The fragile truce has halted large-scale kinetic operations, but the diplomatic and economic battlefields are more intense than ever. Just 24 hours after the historic resignation of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a massive political casualty of the severe economic fallout from Operation Epic Fury, the international community is forced to confront a radically altered geopolitical map. From the volatile energy corridors of the Strait of Hormuz to the ongoing military friction in Lebanon, the true cost of this 4-month war is now being counted. As Western capitals grapple with a glaring credibility deficit and a shifting balance of power, has the attempt to contain Iran instead accelerated the collapse of Western hegemony? These questions and more are put to my panel of experts tonight, shortly. Hello there and welcome to our continuing special coverage on the war in Iran with me, Keir Zachary. And before we open the floor to our panel of leading analysts, let's take a look at this report and then we come back.
A day after U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said Iran had agreed to allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back into the country as a first step toward permanent denuclearization, Tehran pushed back strongly against that claim. Speaking on Tuesday, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Baghai denied that Iran had invited IAEA inspectors to visit key nuclear sites that were recently hit by U.S. and Zionist strikes, directly contradicting Vance's remarks.
We have had no meeting with Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we have no plans for the agency to visit the Iranian nuclear facilities damaged by the military aggression by the United States and the Zionist regime. Fundamentally, no procedure has been envisaged in this regard.
Baghai said Iran remains committed to its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and will continue to follow established international procedures. He also stressed that Iran's military and missile capabilities were never part of the negotiations and are not up for discussion.
Iran's defensive and ballistic capabilities have never been part of our discussions and will never be subject to negotiations with any party.
The Iranian spokesman also addressed questions about the country's recently released frozen assets. He said Tehran would decide how to use the funds based on what best serves Iran's interests, and rejected suggestions that any restrictions had been placed on how the money could be spent.
Regarding the Iranian assets that have been unfrozen, we will decide on the most beneficial and appropriate way to use them for the country. As for the purchase of goods, our Ministry of Agriculture and the other relevant sectors will decide on the approach they consider appropriate based on price and quality. Therefore, no restrictions have been imposed in this regard.
Baghai also said licenses related to Iranian oil sales officially took effect on June 22nd under the agreement, confirming that previously frozen funds are now accessible to Tehran and can be used without restrictions.
All right, let's bring in our experts. Joining me tonight to analyze this geopolitical turning point are four distinguished guests. First, Ms. Masha Kotkin, energy and geopolitical risk analyst and former U.S. State Department advisor. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Hello there, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. And from Washington, D.C. as well is Henry Rogers, Middle East and geopolitics analyst at the New Lines Institute. Hello there, Rogers, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Smetana, visiting fellow at the University of Oxford and associate professor at Charles University. He joins us from Oxford. Hello there, doctor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. And we also have Mr. Fadi Al-Hajjar, international expert on peace and conflict, mediator, and senior political advisor. He joins us from Beirut. Hello there, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
My pleasure. Nice meeting you all.
Thank you. All right, let's kickstart the debate with you, Ms. Masha Kotkin. Energy analyst at Johns Hopkins SAIS have actually highlighted the Iran's asymmetric capabilities in the Strait of Hormuz completely rewrote the playbook of modern or for modern economic warfare. Now, despite months of sustained allied naval operations, global energy markets suffered a shock that exposed the profound fragility of Western supply chains. Now, from a risk advisory standpoint, did Washington fundamentally miscalculate the economic situation or insulation of its allies? And has this war proven that naval dominance can no longer guarantee global energy security when facing modern anti-access, area denial capabilities?
Well, initially, I want to disagree with the fundamental premise. I think the Ukraine war, Ukrainians have rewritten the book on asymmetric warfare, and I believe that Iran picked up on where the Ukrainians started. In terms of a miscalculation, I'm no longer in government, so my observations are from the outside. But I believe that the Washington prioritized security concerns over economic concerns. And Asia specifically had a disproportionate effects of this conflict.
Mm-hmm. But then, do you think that the U.S. administration was expecting this ripple effects of, economic collapse, especially the one hitting Europe and, hence causing, Keir Starmer even to resign?
Well, I think Keir Starmer's ouster is more tied to domestic issues in the UK. While I'm not an expert in UK politics, I believe his stances on defense spending, immigration, and just sort of, economic doldrums contributed more to his resignation than this particular crisis.
Mm-hmm. You haven't noticed any effects coming from this crisis? Actually, the entire world was feeling the shock of, at least energy prices spiking.
For sure. I mean, I'm not, making it less of a conflict. It is the one of the biggest energy crises that we've seen, in many, many years. The supply gap is larger than it was in 1979 and 1973. So from that perspective, yes, but there were coordinated steps that were taken to stabilize the markets. We're not looking at a $200 barrel of oil. We're looking at what now, $76 barrel of oil. So yes, there's global economic slowdown. There's uncertainty. And energy prices went up everywhere, but in a big way. They went up in in South Asia.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. All right, let's bring Henry Rogers to the conversation. Henry Rogers, a core thesis from the New Lines Institute suggests that the February escalation was designed to establish a new permanent baseline of deterrence against Iran's regional network. Instead, the war culminated in a 14-point memorandum of understanding that largely restores the pre-war status quo, while leaving Iran's regional alignment structurally intact. So, looking at the strategic balance, did this war demonstrate the bankruptcy of using heavy military intervention to solve deeply rooted asymmetric political challenges in the Middle East?
Yes, I do believe it did. I believe the United States has made this mistake before, but I would like to get deeper into the nuance and point out that with this asymmetric warfare or this hard military power used against this asymmetric political environment, the U.S. used an air campaign, which is a fetishization in the U.S. military, going back to drone strikes across the Middle East and the global war on terror, Operation Rolling Thunder in Vietnam. And its imperatives and its goalposts that kept being moved by the Trump administration would not have been able to be achieved through this means. And I believe, yes, it does show that, once again, hard military power is ineffective at altering these complex, nuance-requiring political issues in the Middle East.
But then what other intricate matters that could have made this entire operation fail, at least strategically speaking, Rogers?
Well, I believe that the U.S. should have used more diplomatic and economic levers instead of once again doubling down on strikes following its strikes from last summer. And yes, it is a larger picture than more than just being an air campaign, and it's the resilience of the Iranian military structure. But intelligence showed beforehand that Iran had, for example, the Mosaic Doctrine in place to be able to counteract air attacks and was ready and expecting this military doctrine to be applied against it.
But then what happened to the intelligence in the USA? Why would we hear, for example, in reports and analysis that we read, that Israel actually expected this kind of resilience, but then it didn't give any heads up to the United States, and hence Donald Trump is trapped here?
Well, Israel has the imperative to degrade Iran's overall military capabilities, and it cares less about regime change or other imperatives that the Trump administration stated. Its overall goal is to weaken Iran, but also Netanyahu has the internal political goal to be perceived as the defender, to be perceived as the military hardliner against enemies that his constituency fears. So his ability to pull the United States into a conflict and go after that conflict bolsters his political base and his defense imperatives.
But what kind of leverage do you think Israel has over the United States to push it into this big trouble?
I don't believe that the has leverage over the United States, but I do believe that Israel collaborated in tandem with the Trump administration, which also thought and sought after its own goals of regime change and altering what was happening in the conflict and in the dynamic.
Thank you for that, Rogers. Now let me include Dr. Michael Smetana. Dr. Michael, from an arms control and strategic stability perspective, the Pakistani-Qatari mediated agreement accepts local downblending of enriched uranium rather than forcing it out of the Iranian territory, the exact demand that triggered the war to begin with. Now, European security frameworks have long emphasized that upfront economic relief weakens long-term compliance leverage. Now, did the immediate economic pain felt by Western democracies force an existential compromise? I mean, if we're ending up exactly where we started in February, what was the strategic point of this war?
No, I mean, with your last sentence, you are highlighting the important problem. This is like a testament of the fact that even tactical successes do not easily translate to strategic aims or to achieving strategic aims and strategic goals. You've mentioned the downblending of Iran's uranium, which is one of the points in the memorandum mentions that as a potentially future arrangement that will be part of the peace deal. What you mentioned is that in this future deal, Iran would likely have the uranium downblended on its own territory. So let's say that's one of the many things in which United States probably had to compromise in comparison with this earlier demands. And we will still see whether it will be realistic during these 60 days, which is a relatively short period to negotiate an agreement that will also include this very complex agreement on the future of Iran's nuclear program, something which is very challenging, right? If we remember the original JCPOA, the agreement that Obama's administration did, it was negotiated during almost 2 years. It's very difficult to do something like that during the 60 days period.
Would you agree with the analysis that says that this is a worse deal than Obama's deal?
Well, we are not there yet. I mean, the memorandum of understanding is not comparable to a very complex agreement such as the JCPOA, which was an agreement over 100 pages long that set very detailed verification monitoring provisions. This is something that we should get in ideal case, out of these 60 days negotiations. Whether we will get there and whether this administration will be able to negotiate something close to it, that remains an open question, obviously.
Wouldn't it be maybe something temporary, Dr. Michael, just to get by the midterms election domestically? How would you read this point?
What do you mean? If this memorandum is something temporary and eventually the U.S. administration would once again, I mean, that has been a concern all along, and especially from the side of Iran, that U.S. administration, which has twice attacked Iran during the diplomatic negotiations, would eventually once again get back to the military track rather than the diplomatic one. This is one of the many reasons why Iran also wanted to get some concessions at the very beginning of this process, including the release of the frozen assets to kind of get something out of this, before even the negotiations start.
Thank you so much. And now let's turn to another important point that could be hindering the entire peace deal. And here we're talking about Lebanon. And here let me bring Mr. Fadi Al-Hajjar. Mr. Fadi, from your vantage point in Beirut, the MOU explicitly demands a cessation of hostilities on all fronts, including southern Lebanon. Yet, regional actors continue to navigate intense kinetic friction as Israeli leadership insists on maintaining a security buffer zone. Given your extensive experience in conflict mediation, can a Washington-Tehran diplomatic understanding ever hold on the ground if regional states feel their core security interests were bargained away by external superpowers?
Well, thank you for your question. I think it should be divided into two main elements here. Can they, if there is a political will, especially in the White House, definitely they can. But the question, whether they have this will, and the second point is about it's neither interest or need. It's more of a greed for claimed security sometimes, because and I'm talking here directly about Israel, because never committed to any kind of agreement, previous agreements, not on Lebanon, neither on Gaza, nor even in the West Bank or Oslo or any previous one. So Israel has never, committed and adhered to any kind of agreement. And now, despite the fact that sometimes this is jeopardizing American interest, the U.S. interest, the Israelis always keeping this kind of, nuance in intervening and not committing and disturbing anything. And definitely, if we listen to the, Prime Minister of Qatar, he was, not pointing fingers, but not directly talking about some people trying to really disturb the process, to stop, to hold the, all these settlements and agreements, and maybe to put an end even to the memorandum of understanding.
Do you think that this Lebanon issue is actually going to be a real hindering block to this peace deal, Mr. Hajjar?
I think Lebanon is the real test. Whether this is gonna be a sustainable agreement, or it's just a settlement to feed some kind of interest here and there for the Americans. Trump can claim achievements and maybe pass to the upcoming elections. It can be also serving getting for the Iranians some time to take a breath, after all of these attacks. But till now, what's going on the ground, especially in the south, is not promising, because Israel till now is not committed and still attacking. So again, this is a real test, and it is questioning whether this is gonna really take it to a next level of discussion and fulfillment of potential solution, or just maybe make it a stalemate and probably moving back to the violence.
Just to get by the midterm elections. But then that's not the only trouble that analysts have highlighted. I mean, Donald Trump does need, a strategic exit from this war. But then, Mr. Hajar, would you think that, like other analysts, that the strategic alliance between USA and Israel would actually be affected, especially when we heard the latest statements from Vice President J.D. Vance?
Well, it's good to be true, too good to be true sometimes to see and to take it seriously. But several times we heard, we observed this kind of discrepancy or differences between Washington and Israelis. But in reality, later on, they were talking about, for example, in differences regarding the Iran, and then they both jointly attacked Iran. I'm not with Iran or against. I'm just talking about reality. The same for Gaza. So despite the genocide, there is an agreement on Gaza and never been fulfilled. Only the first phase of the agreement was fulfilled, whereby the Israeli prisoners were freed, but never completed. I mean, the other part of the agreement was never fulfilled. So again, with Lebanon, there was an agreement in November 2024, but it wasn't fulfilled again, because Israel never adhered to all of these agreements, and the same before. So back to your question, whether these statements by J.D. Vance and even by President Trump, I'm not sure. Here in this region, we start to doubt everything as analysts, as people, because we need, don't tell me you love me, show me, okay? It's not about what you say, it's about what you do.
Exactly. It's all about what you do. And here I get back to you, Masha, Kotkin. And of course, I asked you a little bit about UK earlier, and I would like to get back to this point a little more in focus. The collapse of the Starmer government in London on June 22nd vividly demonstrated that a localized conflict in the Persian Gulf, for example, can directly trigger constitutional crises in Europe due to energy inflation. And when energy goes up, a lot of commodities go up with it. Now, as European states look toward winter, has this war accelerated a structural decoupling from traditional transatlantic security dependencies, forcing European capitals to perhaps independently evaluate their vulnerability to distant regional wars?
I mean, I think the Europeans have been, it predates this conflict that they've been reevaluating their transatlantic alliance and how to work with a new president. There is a new sort of, plan that they're working on. The details, the evolved transatlantic alliance details, they're rather scarce, but it does include being able to defend themselves. But these types of endeavors take years. I saw I think it was the German Marshall Fund estimated 10 to 15 years for Europe to develop sort of strategic autonomy and fundamentally alter the transatlantic alliance from, let's say, today. So yes, energy crises can trigger new elections, but the UK has had 6 prime ministers in the last 10 years. Affordability is a big deal anywhere in the world. It's just that the UK and the US is in a position to absorb some of these, in a better position to absorb some of these rising costs than, folks in South and East Asia. And yeah.
But technically, that's not the only crisis. You said it predates to a long time, and here maybe you can hark back to the war in Ukraine, which President Donald Trump promised to resolve in 24 hours. Well, then everybody forgot about what's happening in Ukraine, and of course the repercussion that it still has over the continent, and not to mention the threats of Donald Trump of taking, Greenland, and all this is going to make Europe, reconsider everything with the United States. Wouldn't you think that?
Yes and no. The European transatlantic alliance is very important to both sides. The energy alliance is very important in this relationship. So yes, there are things being adjusted. I don't think that there's going to be a complete decoupling. And in terms of Ukraine, Ukraine has been acting more independently. And I think there's an estimate that in the last month, their attacks on Russia's infrastructure has shrunk the ability of Russia to refine its crude by something like 30%. So there is already some independence, but it's just an evolving relationship. I don't think decoupling is the right way to frame it.
Lovely. All right, let's move on now to Henry Rogers. Mr. Henry, leading assessments indicate that while structural damage was inflicted on various command centers during the air campaign in Iran, that is, the operation cohesion of the axis of resistance remains largely functional. If the stated goal of the February 28th operation was to decisively sever Tehran's link to its regional non-state partners, how do hardline policy circles in Washington justify a deal that leaves Iran's command structure and regional influence effectively intact?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because the axis of resistance and severing it has long been a goal of the Trump administration. We saw that in his first term with the assassination of Soleimani, but we see minimal discussion of it in the MOU, and that's because hardliners in DC, which are going to be selling their constituents in the Trump administration, and then the Iranian negotiators understand that Iran is going to be going through a major security grand strategy shift. The conflict, if we've seen it, Iran's main tool of attrition against the West and preventing the US from gaining leverage has been menacing the Strait of Hormuz, not relying on its axis of resistance, which has also been degraded since October 7th with the degradation of Hamas and Hezbollah, air campaigns against the Houthis in Yemen, and then the integration of the PMF in Iraq. So I very much believe that Washington hardliners are going to be more mum on this point. They're going to be muted when it comes to this angle of selling the deal to their constituents because it will work. They feel that it'll work itself out more or less through Iranian grand strategy shifting.
But what if it doesn't? I mean, everybody's saying that it is fragile, and Tehran actually managed to put a lot of pressure, I mean, at least on regional allies to the United States, who on themselves were putting a lot of pressure on President Donald Trump to put an end to all this mess.
Well, President Donald Trump and the Trump administration are already having a difficult time selling this deal at home and will continue to. When it's going to come to the midterm elections and Trump's reliance on his base and his political base, which we've already seen be productive in preliminary Republican midterms, but Trump has more or less understood that by instigating this conflict, he's going to lose large swaths of the House of Representatives and take damage in the midterms. So when it comes to selling this deal, Trump is going to continue his instinctual and bullish force pushing it through more than a finessed detail by detail explanation to his base.
Perfect. Now, let me turn to Dr. Michael Smetana. Dr. Michael, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, faces a monumental task monitoring down blending within Iran under the new MOU. Now, critics argue that leaving the material inside the country means Iran retains its latent breakout capacity, meaning 4 months of intensive kinetic operations yielded zero structural rollback of their nuclear knowledge bases. Was the military option exposed as incapable of achieving deterrence? And what dangerous precedent do you think this set for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons?
I would say coercive diplomacy rather than deterrence. That would be point number one. And when we go back to June 2025 strikes already last year, we recall that at the time, United States was able to significantly degrade Iran's capability by striking Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, very key nuclear site. But already at the time, we knew that despite these, what we can call potentially tactical successes, Iran still retained large stocks of both low-enriched and high-enriched uranium. Iran still retained a capability to reconstitute its enrichment capability. Iran still retained some very deep buried underground locations where it can reconstitute its nuclear program. It still retains its knowledge base, and it still retains potentially the resolve to build nuclear weapons in case it decides so. Now, these strikes from February 26 onwards, they didn't really change this reality. And there is actually a concern that if they achieve something, is that strengthen the position of some of Iran's hard partners who long have argued or believed that this strategy of former Ayatollah Khamenei of this sort of like maintaining hedging threshold capability wasn't actually the best strategy that there was. And there is a potentially even more significant risk that absent of a complex agreement that will also include complex verification monitoring provisions. In the future, the chance for Iran to actually crossing the nuclear threshold, building a bomb, has increased rather than decreased as a result of these U.S. strikes.
But then if we come to look at it, when the objectives of the war were declared, at least the direct ones, they were speaking about the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and they have a problem with Iran having nuclear weapon. But then we don't see that when it comes to Israel. Israel is a non-signatory, actually, of the non-proliferation treaty, and yet nobody talks to it about it.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say nobody talks about it, right? At every NPT review conference, there is a debate about countries that have nuclear weapons but are not party to the NPT, which is Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea. So in this case, we have 9 nuclear-armed countries, but only 5 of them are permanent members of the NPT. So, but absolutely. I mean, Israel is a country that has nuclear weapons, has a nuclear arsenal like this since the late 1960s, and there is probably like no discussion, like realistic discussion about any possibility of Israel nuclear disarmament, or I mean any other nuclear armed country that is among these 9 for the matter.
Perfect. Now let me turn to Mr. Fadi Al-Hajjar with a different point. Mr. Hadi, it is highly significant that this entire diplomatic breakthrough was brokered not by traditional Western emissaries, but via mediations or back channels by Qatar and Pakistan. This suggests a quite important shift or shifting center of gravity for international mediation. So how would you read this? Does the architecture of this MOU actually signal that Washington has lost its historical role as the exclusive security broker, let's put it this way, in the Middle East? And how are local actors adapting to this multipolar diplomatic reality, according to you?
Well, let me also divide it into a few points. First, like Qatar has been involved in several mediations in different areas, including Africa, and even in Afghans, between the Americans and the Afghans, between American and Taliban before and later on Afghanistan government, even between the US and Iran, in 2023, and they made a deal, The significance probably in this MOU, I would say the role of Pakistan. And I think it has to do with, geographical proximity of Pakistan being next to Iran, which is, next door. So it's critical for Pakistan. This is one. Second, I think that there is no alternative Western power to play this role because, probably they can be in good terms with the US, but Iran has a different perspective regarding any potential Western, mediation. So I guess, there was a need for somewhat neutral or perceived from both sides parties that can really be good brokers and impartial without, going in more or less being biased to any of the parties. Second point, actually, it was really helpful. It's about the failure of the, of the military option. So this policy of double-click war and to swift victory without, doing any calculations similar to what Mr. Roger was saying. I think also there were new cards on the table here. Iran played it well. I mean, the Hormuz Straits card, which has an impact worldwide, including the US, the increase in oil prices, even in the US, is, put a lot of pressure, not only the US allies, but even internal, pressure about the impact, and as I mentioned before, just before the election. So several factors contributed to this. But back to your question, yes, there is a change. There is a change in the international order, but there is no yet a new world order.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. And since you brought up the macroeconomic costs of sanctions and the issues that it resulted actually after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, let me bring Ms. Masha Kotkin again. Ms. Masha, to restore maritime trade normalcy, the U.S. Treasury is moving ahead with sweeping financial and oil export waivers for Tehran. Now, hardline fiscal analysts argue this will immediately pump billions of dollars back into the Iranian economy before any permanent regional security concessions are really finalized. Now, from a geopolitical risk perspective, did the fear of an entrenched global recession completely break the West's economic leverage? Or is this just a temporary domestic factor linked to midterm elections? Maybe things are going to change later after it had some effect on economy. We see some ease and maybe the Americans are going to be happy for a short period and then back to square one.
Well said. So the sanctions, the U.S. is the only one that has temporarily lifted sanctions. And I think the general license expires on August 21st. 60 days is not a lot of time. Iranian oil has been bought by China for many years. I think over 90% goes to China already. India is like maybe buy a little bit of oil. I understand that Iranian representatives have reached out to refineries in Japan and South Korea, and those customers are wary. The downside risk of, agreeing to purchase oil from Iran and for the sanctions to go back into force will keep Iran from gaining new customers. But given how much Iran wants to export, you could see that since last Thursday, I believe they put something like 68 million barrels on the water ready to be bought. It's unclear where they're going to go. And Places like India and China reduced its imports. India bought Russian oil, and other Asian countries have enough of a buffer until the end of August. So while Iran is going to earn some revenue, it's not sure it's kind of a short-term solution unless the negotiations continue and things continue going well in terms of working out the terms. Is it kicking the can down after midterm elections? Sanctions are a smaller part. The fund, the investment fund, is somewhat of a thorny issue domestically here, and the war has been unpopular here, and is getting more and more popular the longer it lasts. So it's marginal. The overall picture is, for the American consumer, it's an unpopular war that raised prices because the exports doubled out of the United States to fill the physical gap left by the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Prices here went up. The price, food inflation has gone up. So those are the kind of issues that are important. And traditionally, U.S. voters have held the party in charge responsible for negative economic developments, regardless of whether or not they had they were party to these economic conditions. So, congressmen are worried about their reelection prospects because of this affordability.
And it hasn't just been unpopular domestically. I mean, of course, Americans are complaining about their pockets, but then at the international level as well, the credibility of the United States is at stake, especially when we see the double standards dealing with their regional ally and with adversaries. But then here, let me ask you, Henry Rogers, if we come to look closer at this intricate situation, we're seeing unprecedented rhetorical variance between Washington and Tel Aviv regarding the implementation of the ceasefire terms in Lebanon, like I said earlier. Now, the New Lines Institute has frequently analyzed the limits of alliance management during high-intensity operations. Now, is the United States finding out that its unconditional security guarantees have granted its regional partners a veto over its own global economic and diplomatic survival?
Well, when we look at the United States and Israel, especially in the Trump and Netanyahu dynamic that we're existing in right now, we have to remember that Israel is the junior partner and the U.S. is the one with the leverage over it. There's considerable soft power that Israel has within the United States. But when it comes to this rhetoric variance, this is actually both Trump and Netanyahu understand that they benefit from pushing back from one another. Trump in America, the Republican Party, and the conservative side of the American political spectrum over the last few years has continued to fracture over the Israel issue, and American public opinion is turning against the genocide in Gaza and other actions Israel has been taking. So by pushing back against Netanyahu and looking strong on Netanyahu, Trump benefits in that regard. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has an upcoming election in September, and by pushing back against Trump and painting himself not as a proxy and also continuing to push forward against Iran and push back against this deal, he's able to market himself in a positive light for his political base. But when it comes to the geopolitics of Israel and the United States, Israel very much is the junior partner, and we may see a continuation of minor ceasefire violations, continuing that pattern we've seen in both Gaza and previous Lebanon ceasefires. But at the end of the day, it is going to be privy to the deal, as the U.S. is going to make it privy to that deal.
But then all these troubles and and settlement and all this mess in the Middle East is actually going to be seized by other rivals such as China and Russia, who are actually spreading a lot of influence in Asia, in Africa, and now in the Middle East. How would you look at it?
I definitely think that both China and Russia are moving in the Middle East, with the former Wagner Group, Africa Corps, making inroads in North Africa, and China now having a more open angle with Iran going to be changed over the next few years, and its relationship with China existing, and the US's relationship with Israel very much isolates it from other regional neighbors. So I would say there is going to be a considerable altering of relationships in the Middle East over the next 10 years, especially as the Trump administration and US conservatives continue to advocate for a withdrawal of the US forward posture. So yes, the Israeli-US relationship does damage US relations in the Middle East, and it does open the window to some more great power competition from both China and Russia.
Would you expect a larger realignment? I mean, how soon is this going to emerge, or at least to appear on the scene there?
Well, let me be clear. I'm not advocating or indicating that there's going to be a realignment where Russia or China becomes the dominant actor in the Middle East, more that the US withdrawals partially more. But this timeline, I'd say, would come over the next decade or more than that, as the ramifications of the Iran war, the ramifications of both wars in Lebanon and Gaza are going to take years to cement themselves in the power politics of the region.
Lovely. Thank you. Now, Dr. Michael Smetana, modern strategic doctrine often relies on the concept of escalation dominance, the idea that a superpower can control the ceiling of a war or a conflict. However, Iran's multi-layered response proved that in an interconnected global system, war cannot be nearly contained or neatly contained to a single theater. So has the outcome of the 2026 war fundamentally discredited the Western doctrine of limited kinetic containment against highly integrated regional powers?
Not sure if fundamentally discredited, but we can definitely see the limits of air power. Once again, we can see it in fundamentally shaping the strategic outcomes. We can also observe how important, once again, is to not to only look at the balance of forces, but also the balance of resolve between the actors. And we can also see in place the technological developments of the past few years, in which Iran was able and still is able to demonstrate how relatively cost-effective asymmetric strategy is sufficient in order to inflict pain on the world's largest superpower. We saw that the United States spent a very large stock of its precision ammunitions that were extremely expensive and still were not able to achieve the strategic outcomes it wanted. And I think that obviously brings some of the lessons for the future conflicts as well.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And as we reach in the end of this special coverage tonight, I would like to ask a quick round of questions, beginning with you, Mr. Fadi Al-Hashar. Mr. Fadi, if we look at the situation in Lebanon, for months the sovereignty has been severely strained by intense aerial bombardments and shifting front lines. Now, as international law experts debate the legal weight of the MOU, what structural guarantees are needed on the ground in Beirut to ensure that small states are no longer used as kinetic backdrops for superpower negotiations?
One of the most important one is probably, a kind of hope. I don't know if it can be translated into real, practice. It's about, because Lebanon definitely a shaky, fragile, weak state. Definitely they don't have control on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is more affiliated with Iran. But at the same time, the US is pressuring Lebanon to join the negotiation in an imbalanced way. So to maintain what you said already, to sustain this kind of, practice or imbalance of power. What is really needed, and I said if there is a political will, is to have a serious and a genuine American will and the practice to hold Israel accountable for everything being done, whether in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Syria, and even to respect the peace treaties they agreed upon with different countries, including Jordan and Egypt, because they have even violated some terms of these agreements. So back to your question, yes, there is a possibility, but unfortunately, it's all within the prerogatives and the capacity of the US. And till to date, it seems that they're not willing to take and make such a decision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And very quickly, Ms. Masha Kotkin, if we look at the economic system in general, throughout this conflict, major economic hubs across the global south openly rejected the enforcement of secondary unilateral sanctions, continuing to facilitate alternative payment routes for commodities. Now, does this structural defiance indicate that the weaponization of the SWIFT network, for example, and international dollar clearings has reached a point of diminishing returns, permanently reducing the potency of Western economic statecraft?
I think this conversation has continued over many years. When will the dominance of the dollar, fade? SWIFT is just facilitates transactions, but the US dollar is the currency that most energy commodities are bought and sold in, and there are very few exceptions to that particular trend at this time. The dollar is easy to exchange for other currencies. Other currencies may not be as tradable as the US dollar. And has sanctions policy been, structurally easier, imposing sanctions, because of SWIFT and the US dollar dominance? Yes. The commodity, being traded in, energy commodities being traded in other currencies. The only two cases that I'm aware of are, Chinese currency and Russian currency, and they're not significant amounts. I do not see, that changing significantly.
But it could accelerate it, yes, not in the immediate term, like many analysts have said it, but actually it could accelerate this process.
Potentially. Yeah, I agree, potentially. But I think the evolution would take more time than a couple of years from now.
Logically. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. My deepest gratitude and thanks to all my guests tonight, Ms. Masha Kotkin from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Mr. Henry Rogers from Washington, D.C. Thank you as well for the sharp analysis. Dr. Michael Smetana from Oxford. Thank you for all the time you gave us. And Mr. Fadi Al-Hajjar from Beirut, thank you as well for the sharp analysis. Thank you all indeed for all these valuable insights. Now, to sum it up, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's urgent debate, our panel has masterfully traced the extensive systematic shockwaves defining this post-war environment on June 23rd, 2026. We analyzed how the severe economic and energy vulnerabilities that unseated the British Prime Minister just the day before yesterday that are shaping the calculations of Western risk advisors. We dissected the fragile nuclear regional compromises built into the Swiss MOU, the escalating friction within traditional alliances, and the emergent diplomatic frameworks being enforced by actors in the global south. Well, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to our channel, and until next time, have a good one.